Good morning. Welcome to the Skepta channel. I'm your host, Dr. Mani Iyer. Uh, let's start. Every time we hear about a teenager committing a serious crime, first reaction is often shock. We ask ourselves, how could someone so young do something like this? Was it anger? Was it bad parenting? Was it peer pressure? Or was it trauma? Or is there always a deeper story that we don't get to see? Today, we are starting a new series called Understanding Young Minds, where we'll explore the psychology behind juvenile crime through real life anonymized case conversations based on clinical experience. The aim isn't to justify criminal behavior, but to understand the young mind behind it, because understanding is often the first step towards prevention, intervention, and rehabilitation. To help us unpack this fascinating and often misunderstood logic, we have with us psychologist Ms. Ayesha Khaleel. Welcome back, Ayesha. It's wonderful to see you again on our show. And Ayesha, as you know, Ayesha Khaleel, she's a renowned clinical psychologist with a master's degree in clinical psychology, and she's a practicing psychologist with more than 3 years of experience. She has completed clinical training and internship at NIMHANS with experience in the Department of Psychiatry, gaining exposure to a wide range of mental health conditions. She has worked as a full-time psychologist across three different organizations, including mental health counselor at the juvenile home in Bangalore, where she worked with adolescents and young adults in conflict with the law. She is currently an independent practicing psychologist providing therapy to individuals across different age groups for concerns including anxiety, stress, depression, relationship issues, OCD, self esteem, and emotional well being. Our therapeutic approach is primarily based on cognitive behavioral theory while integrating other evidence based techniques to tailor treatment according to each individual's needs. Yeah, welcome to the show, Aisha. And I would like you to, discuss upon this topic, and let us. So let's hear Aisha G out. Over to you, Aisha.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Mani. It's
Yeah,
always a pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited to begin this new series and about the juvenile crime, right? And in
right.
our previous discussion, we spoke about why our brain naturally focuses on negative thoughts. Today, we are moving into a completely different area of psychology, one that is often very misunderstood and emotionally charged, and sometimes it's even very uncomfortable to even talk about. So, we are going to talk about juvenile crime. Whenever we hear that a teenager has committed a crime, our immediate reaction is usually shock or surprise. So, the questions that immediately come to our mind are, how could someone so young do something like this? Or where were the parents? Didn't this child know the difference between right and wrong? What was he up to? So these are the questions that naturally come up in our mind. Sometimes we even conclude that the child is simply bad or beyond repair, or nothing can be done about him. So, and honestly, these reactions are understandable, and crime affects real people. So victims suffer, families suffer, communities suffer. So today's discussion is not about taking away accountability or making excuses for criminal behavior. A crime is still a crime, and every action has consequences. But at the same time, as psychologists, we ask another equally important question: what happened before the crime? Because behavior, especially repeated behavior, doesn't appear overnight. It doesn't come up suddenly. So there's usually a story behind and story before the story. So there are experiences, relationships, learning, beliefs, and environments that slowly shape the way a young person begins to think, feel, and behave. One of the biggest lessons I learned while working in a juvenile home was this. If we only study the crime, we'll understand very little. But if we study the child behind the crime, we often begin to understand why it happened. And understanding is extremely important. Because when we understand the factors that contribute to the crime, we move one step closer towards preventing it. Before I begin today's case, I'd like to make one thing very clear. The case I'm about to discuss is inspired by my professional experience working with children in conflict with law in the juvenile home. So, to protect confidentiality, identifying details such as names, locations, etc., have been changed. So, the purpose of today's discussion is purely educational. So, let's begin. So let's begin with the case first. I'd like you to imagine a boy. We'll simply call him A. He was around 16 years old when I met him. And now, if I asked you to imagine a teenager involved in multiple theft cases, many people would probably picture someone who's struggled in school, constantly got into trouble, or wasn't interested in studies, or he got bad grades, etc. But A wasn't like that at all. He was brilliant and he was a very bright student, a very talented kid. He performed well academically, confident, and came across as a very articulate young boy when I first took his counseling session. So, he belonged to a lower middle class family, and according to his parents, had spent most of his childhood with his grandparents until he was around 9 or 10 years old. When I later met his parents during counseling, they shared something very interesting, and I'd like to share that with you as well. They felt that because his grandparents loved him dearly and rarely denied him anything at all, A had grown up expecting immediate gratification. Like if he needs something, he needs it immediately without any questions. So, uh, anything but like waiting frustrated him a lot. It annoyed him. So his parents often described him as extremely stubborn. Another thing they mentioned was that he was very close to his elder sister, and which reminds us that children involved in crime are not incapable of love or attachment. They are extremely capable of forming healthy relationships as well. So they are just often much more complex than we imagine. Now, A had come to the juvenile home because of multiple theft cases. Naturally, during counseling, I wanted to understand why. Okay. Was it financial difficulty, peer pressure, family circumstance? But the answer he gave me was something which I never expected. One day I asked him, "What do you think about everything that's happened?" And smiled and he smiled and told me, "Ma'am, next time I don't want to steal." For a moment, I felt kind of relieved. I thought perhaps he had started recognizing the consequences of his actions. So I asked why. And his reply was, "Because next time I want to do something bigger, not just stealing." So he was kind of used to stealing and he wanted to achieve something bigger or do something bigger. That answer completely caught me off guard. So I asked him what he meant. He said, "Stealing is easy now. I have already done it. Next time it should be something more difficult. Otherwise, what's the fun, man? So this was his reply. Listening to him, I realized something. He wasn't looking at crime the way most of us do. He wasn't thinking about victims. He wasn't thinking about legal consequences at all. He was looking at crime almost like progressing through levels in a video game. You understand? So it was as if he was in a video game and he was progressing through the levels. Complete one level, move on to the next. So every successful theft had become a reward. And once one level no longer felt exciting, he wanted something more challenging. That was the moment I realized that if we only focused on stopping the theft, we would completely miss understand how his mind had started interpreting the mind interpreting the crime in the first place. Okay, so I think that's where psychology becomes incredibly important. Because before we ask how do we stop this behavior, we first have to ask how did this behavior become rewarding for him? Right.
Aisha, I
Yeah.
have to admit, this way of thinking is something
Mm-hmm.
I never expected. Most people
Mm-hmm.
assume children commit crimes because they are angry, either angry or rebellious, or simply don't care. But listening to this case, it almost sounds as though the brain has had started rewarding the behavior itself. So, where do we even begin to understand something like this? How does a teenager start seeing crime almost like progressing through a levels of a game?
Right. Right. That's a wonderful question, Dr. Mani. And I think the first thing I'd like everyone listening to understand is this. Children are not born thinking crime is rewarding. Nobody is born believing that stealing is exciting or that breaking the law is an achievement. Like every other behavior we develop in life, these patterns are learned, or we can also call as learned behavior. When I continued working with A, I slowly began understanding how he looked at crime. For him, every successful theft gave him something, not just money. So, money is secondary for him. So, a feeling that was something like a feeling, a sense of achievement, a thrill, a sense of control. He had taken a risk and he had succeeded. So, and nothing major had happened immediately afterwards. So, in psychology, we often explain this using something called learning theory, particularly operant conditioning. Now, please don't let the terminology sound complicated. Just remember the word. It's called operant conditioning. It's a behavioral learning theory in psychology. So, the idea is actually very simple. As human beings, we naturally tend to repeat behaviors that feel rewarding, right? So think about everyday life. If a student studies hard and scores good marks, they are more likely to study again. And if someone exercises regularly and starts feeling healthier and they start achieving the results, they are more likely to continue exercising. Right? Our brain learns this behavior gives me something good. The same principle can unfortunately work in unhealthy ways too. Right. So in A's case, every successful theft became a reward. So what happened was he experienced excitement. So the important thing is he felt smart that um, so whenever he started to steal, nobody caught him, and he started to feel very smart, and that he felt as if he had outwitted people. And because he wasn't immediately facing consequences each time, his brain slowly learned something dangerous. This works. Okay, this definitely works. So the behavior was being reinforced because he was being rewarded. because of the sense of achievement, because it worked every time he did it. So, and the more it was reinforced, the stronger it became. Eventually, stealing no longer gave him the same excitement. Just like in a video game, once you complete one level several times, it stops feeling challenging. So you want something bigger, something harder, something more exciting. So that's exactly how he described it to me. Mm, Crime had slowly become a game for him. Each offense felt like progressing to the next level. So now comes the interesting part. The thing I noticed was his difficulty with waiting. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, his parents often described how he wanted things immediately. So if he wanted something, he expected it right away. Okay, so psychologically, we also call this as difficulty with delayed gratification. So delayed gratification simply means being able to wait for a larger reward instead of choosing an immediate one. So, for example, imagine a child who receives some pocket money. One child saves it for a month to buy something bigger. Another, uh, he spends it immediately because waiting feels unbearable for him. So neither child is good or bad. They're simply responding differently to rewards. So, coming back to our A, over time he had learned to chase immediate rewards. The excitement, the satisfaction, all came instantly. There was very little thinking about long term consequences. So, long term consequences as in uh, trouble with the law and his image within the society and like things like that. So, that's something we often see during adolescence in general. Teenagers naturally tend to seek novelty. So they enjoy seeking excitement, they explore, they take risks. Most teenagers channel that energy into sports, adventures, studies, or hobbies. Right? But when that need for excitement combines with unhealthy learning experiences and poor decision making and repeated reinforcement, so it can sometimes move towards risky or even criminal behavior. So, another thing I found fascinating while working with him was that he wasn't completely comfortable with the person he had become. There were sessions where he became emotional, there were sessions where he cried, and I think that's important to mention because people often assume children involved in crime never feel guilt or conflict. That's not always true. So our A was actually struggling with something we call identity conflict. On one side, there were the beliefs he had gradually developed over the years about the crimes. And on the other side, our counseling sessions were challenging those belief systems that he had learned over the years. So, for the first time, someone was asking him questions he had never really asked for himself. So, the questions were like, why does this feel rewarding? Who do you want to become? What kind of life do you actually want? So, slowly, he began questioning his own thinking, and that's not an easy process. Imagine believing something for years, and suddenly someone asks you to look at it differently, right? How do you feel? It's really very confusing, sometimes very uncomfortable, sometimes even painful. That's exactly what was happening with A. There was a part of him that wanted to change, like really change. But there was another part that still held on to the old way of thinking because that was familiar and comfortable. So, and I think that's a very human experience, not just in crime. All of us struggle when we are trying to change long standing habits and belief systems. So, whether it's smoking, procrastination, anger, or unhealthy relationships. Change isn't simply about deciding to be different, it's about gradually learning a different way of thinking and behaving, and also challenging our old habits and old belief system. It's about gradually learning a different way of thinking and behaving. So when I look back at A's case, I don't just see theft or stealing. I see a young boy whose brain had slowly learned that crime was rewarding, whose behavior had been reinforced over time, and who was now standing between two identities, and which are like the person he had been and the person he still had the opportunity to become. Okay, so now let's move on to some of the myths and misconceptions about juvenile crime. Okay, so one thing working in a juvenile home taught me is how many misconceptions exist about children involved in crime. Perhaps the biggest myth is that simply born criminals. In reality, I never met a child and thought the child was born to commit crime. Every child had a stories, different struggles, different environments. So, different personalities also. And some had experienced neglect in their family, some had experienced abuse, some had peer influences where the friends started doing the behaviors related to crime. So, they also learned that it is okay to do it. So this is called as peer influence. So some also struggled with substance abuse, and some were very impulsive and acted impulsively. Some really didn't understand the consequences of their behavior at all. So they thought what they did was actually right in their own perspectives. So no two children were the same. Another myth is that understanding a child's background means justifying the crime. It doesn't. So, understanding explains the behavior, understanding the child's background, where they came from, it explains the behavior of the crime. So, as psychologists, we can hold two truths at the same time. A child must be held accountable, and at the same, child may also need help. Those ideas don't contradict each other. In fact, they often go together. Something else that surprised me was how many of these children still had dreams, like real dreams, like we all have. Some wanted to become mechanics, some wanted to become government like employees, some wanted to support their parents, some wanted a completely different life. They actually weren't dreaming about becoming lifelong criminals at all. And that's something I think society sometimes forgets. So children are still developing, their personalities are still forming, their values are still changing. One mistake, like even a serious one, doesn't necessarily define who they will become 20 years from now. No, that's not their identity or that's not their label. And that can be changed. So, and I think A reminded me of that because despite everything he had learned, despite the beliefs he had developed, there was still a part of him that questioned it. The fact that he cried during the sessions told me something very important. The conflict was still alive, and as long as that conflict exists, there is still room for change. So,
Yeah, so I heard about that. So you're saying there is still room for change. So listening to this completely changes the way we think about juvenile offenders. But I think the biggest question people still have is, can children like this boy actually change? Can therapy and rehabilitation genuinely make a difference? Or does one serious mistake define the rest of their lives?
okay. I genuinely believe they can change. Okay? Not every child, and it's not an overnight process, and not without effort at all. But yes, change is absolutely possible. So, one of the biggest goals of therapy is not simply to stop a behavior, it's to understand what keeps that behavior alive. Once A began recognizing why crime felt rewarding, we explored consequences beyond immediate rewards. We discussed empathy, responsibility, long term goals, and perhaps most importantly, his identity. Because if someone continues seeing themselves as I am the kind of person who steals, change becomes very difficult. So, what we do is we slowly work on the belief system that uh, they are not the like permanently the one who steals. Okay, we start changing their identity and the labels they have placed upon themselves. So, but if they like, what happens is if they slowly begin seeing themselves as I'm capable of making different choices, their behavior often begins changing too. So different choices as in I can still think about the consequences. I can channelize my effort somewhere productive, like studies or working in which like they are talented in, etc. So uh, the thing is, therapy isn't magic, but it doesn't erase the past, but it helps people build a different future. Of course, therapy alone it isn't enough. Family support matters, education matters, positive friendships matter, a safe environment matters. Rehabilitation is never one person's job. It's a collective effort. And I'd like to end with one thought. Whenever we hear about juvenile crime, it's easy to ask, what's wrong with this child? But perhaps we can ask a more useful question. That is, what happened to this child and what can we do now to prevent another child from following the same path? Because ultimately, our goal shouldn't just be punishing crime, our goal should be reducing it. And that begins by understanding the young mind behind the behavior. Okay, so, and I hope this conversation encouraged you to look beyond the offense and see the human being behind it. And yes, Dr. Maniji.
Yeah, that really, I mean, yeah,
Mhm.
first, we are all humans. So that is what I'm getting the message. And there is always a possibility for change, right?
Mhm.
That is also come clearly through what you have been saying. So that
Mhm.
even if somebody has made some mistakes, that is not defining. He can always go and change himself back and, have a new future and do something different. And so that is, and something which the society also will be, which will respect him for doing that. So we as common people, and I mean, we means as well as a psychologist, our thing is to support them, give them another opportunity, so that they can correct themselves and they can come out of this. So I really, I think, I hope this boy, can come out of all this and use his talents so that he's got good talents, but those talents need to be channeled in a right direction. And so, if that happens, he will definitely become a winner, not a loser. So, with that thought, I would like to close this. I thank you very much for coming here today on our channel and talking about, juvenile children and about their criminality and all that. Which there were some misconceptions in the society, but you cleared all of them. So I thank you very much for the same, and we look forward to more shows from you. So hopefully we can see you soon enough. Thank you very much, Ji, and good day to you, and have a great evening, great afternoon. Thank you very much. Bye
Thank,
bye. Good
thank you
day.
so much.
Take
Thank you
care.
so much.
Yeah.
Bye bye. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ayesha Ji. Thank you. Bye.